Welcome to this first recorded lecture and video for the 01 Jupyter Lecture Notebook. This first recorded video here will go over the beginning of this notebook. There's going to be a few of these recordings to keep them kind of short so you can listen and find exactly the information you're looking for. As part of this recording, I do want to point out the beginning of this notebook, which is really important for you to read very carefully. And it really says what this course is exactly. And to get a sense of that, you have to really understand we're talking about programming for data science. And so we're learning a programming language, which is objectively a difficult thing for many people to do. It was difficult for me when I was first learning it. It's much like learning a foreign language, and there's extraordinarily strict rules of diction and syntax. How you write things, the notation that you use, it's all very, very important. And then data science itself exists at the intersection between mathematics, statistics, computer science, domain knowledge, and information science. So there's a lot that goes into this class, and while you should read this carefully, I'm not going to read this part to you. I really want you to read this carefully because it helps to set the expectations for what this class is and what it is not, and the amount of effort it will probably take in order to get the most out of this class. So if you haven't already read it, please do. If you have, I won't waste your time by going through it more slowly than necessary. So this is the video that will show up here when you play this. So if you're watching it, you've probably already done it. Or if you're watching this by clicking the link that I provided on the Canvas page, then you'll see to run this, you'll run that right here, that triangle that looks like a play button. Run the selected cells in advance. If you run this, so this is an old link, I'm going to replace this with this newer video. If you were to run that, then you would see this YouTube video this one I'm making now, that will replace this one. So this link will change, and you'll be able to watch the video within here, and you can always expand this a little bit to watch it. So I will, for the most part, just skip over that because we need to go right into this. Learning objectives for this notebook. You're going to understand this notebook environment. The .ipynb extension stands for Interactive Python Notebook. That's what these things were called before the Jupyter environment grew to include a lot of other things. You're going to understand the difference between code and markdown cells, which are the two primary cells that make up a notebook that we'll use in this course. And then you will create and execute code cells and understand how the order of execution impacts results. And then you'll create markdown cells with some stylized text formats. And so I show some stylized text in here. And you can see how all of this is done. I do discuss this down below about how to enter into an edit mode and see how everything's made to look the way it does within this notebook. But I'll just go ahead and scroll down to where that is and then say you can do what I'm saying about editing cells to any cell in here. So this stuff you should read. The point of these videos isn't for me to read everything to you verbatim. It's to hit the most important points of the notebook for you to help orient yourself, that you can then read through it carefully and get the most out of the notebook. This is kind of giving you an overview of what it is that you should read carefully. So I do provide this link. Anything that has this kind of blue looking font here, when you click on it and it highlights it, underlines it, if you were to click on that, it would take you to a web page that's about Jupyter. And we're working in a Jupyter lab interface on a Jupyter hub. So this is something that you can read more about, the Jupyter notebooks or the individual files. I just provide the link so that you could peruse, spend a little bit of time seeing it, looking at all the impressive places where Jupyter is currently being used at, and you can get a sense of why I'm using it in this class. I explain what a notebook is. A notebook is made up of a lot of cells. The idea of the notebook is that we're going to turn your computing device into a computational laboratory where experiments, meaning scientific computations, are not only reproducible but understandable and explainable as well. So again, there's more here for you to read, and you should read it. The main takeaways are you should think of the notebook as some sort of living organism, because it's not exactly static even if it appears that way. It is made up of individual cells. So right now, this is a markdown cell, and you can see that it's a markdown cell right here. And I've selected it because it's in blue. And I point that out in this next cell, that if you left click right? You do your left click, your typical selection once, just once initially. You'll see this blue bar that will show up on the left of a cell to show you essentially the size and scope of a cell. And that's letting you know it's being selected, but it's not being edited. We'll discuss how to edit the cell in a second. So when you see that, one thing you might try to do is if you click on that cell, notice what happened. It shrunk and it was replaced by these dots. Now I can re-enlarge the cell by either clicking there on that. See, it goes away. It's just collapsing the contents. Or I can click on the dots and make it come back. So you should really play around with this environment, get used to interacting with it. And you might just find if there's a lot of things that are useful, but maybe you don't need them at the moment, you might want to minimize the contents. And then you can always re-enlarge them, bring them back to life by just clicking on that bar. So I'm going to stop playing around with that now. And then I'll just point out that there's two really important types of cells in a notebook. There are markdown cells like this one that display text with some formatting. And there's cheat sheets that you should look at. Again, that was a link. And here's a markdown cheat sheet that describes how you can type in markdown in order to make text appear a certain way. So there's all this information here, and you should really spend probably about 20 to 30 minutes looking through this and understanding it. A lot of the elements of that are within this notebook though. Code cells contain code. And they execute with a kernel, and you can see the kernel we're using here is Python 3, and you can see if I hover my cursor over it, it says switch kernel underneath it. We're going to focus primarily on, in fact exclusively on Python 3 in this class. There are also things called raw cells that are good for displaying code and do not run. We don't really ever use those, but I do show an example in this first notebook. So I'll show you here, you should read this very carefully. Like all things in the notebook, really read carefully. I try to make things into a lot of bullet points and easily digestible sentences and short paragraphs, but you might have to reread things as you're learning. I just want to show you how to go into an edit mode. So in an edit mode, to get into an edit mode in a markdown cell so it doesn't look like this nice text, I can double click. So I'm going to do that now. Double left click. And notice it's now in a mode where I can edit it, but I'm not in an edit mode yet. This is still blue, so it's selected, but as soon as I put my cursor in here by clicking anywhere, left clicking anywhere, notice that it's surrounded by a blue bounding box. You see it there? That goes all the way around the code, this cell, this markdown cell, not a code cell, markdown cell. So now I can edit it. So I could, put some random text here, and then by either running the cell contents and advancing, coming up to the run menu and saying to run the selected cells, or run the cell, and I don't want to insert anything below, but I maybe do want to do run cells and don't advance. Control Enter is the keyboard shortcut, which is what I'll typically do. I'm typically going to use keyboard shortcuts to execute cells when I'm showing you in the videos, and I'll either do Control Enter to execute the cell but not move to the next one, or Shift Enter, which will execute the cell and then move to the next one. So watch, if I do Control Enter, it looks like what it first did, except the text I added is now here. I put some random text here. If I don't like that, I simply remove it. And now I'll press Control Enter again, and it's gone. So you can play around and you can edit anything that you see here. And I highly encourage students to do that, because you might find that the instructions or explanations I give don't quite make sense to you. I try to make them make sense, but you might find that if it was only said in a different way, it would make so much more sense. Well, you can make it say whatever you want. You can edit this and say to enter this mode for a markdown cell, to enter this mode, you might say what mode? The edit mode. You might want to have that as part of the instructions when you're reading it. Go, oh, that means a lot more to me when I read it that way. Because this should be a useful document for you to reference later on when you're trying to review this material, perhaps for another class, or you want to use it in another context. So I leave it to you to edit this as you see fit, change instructions or edit them, add to them, do whatever you want. It's a living document that you can make it in your own image. And you can see how I did anything, how I did a strike through. If you want to make mistakes, there's some tildes here. You can see how this is done. It's also in the cheat sheet. This is how I reference a URL. I use square brackets around a word and then parentheses around the URL, the web page address. And again, that's the same cheat sheet that I had already linked to and shown you before. So I suggest that you try editing some text now, play around with it, and you can pause the video, do that right now. You could do it later. You could watch the rest of the video and then do it. But you should really try to make this your own and spend time, a few hours with this initial notebook, playing around, going through all the instructions and making sure it makes sense. Now, the text editor will not automatically close if you switch to another cell and you haven't run it. So I'm going to show you that now. I can open up multiple markdown cells, which is what, again, the markdown cells hold the text, and the blue bounding box shows me which one I've selected for editing mode. And if I ever press the escape key, which I'm going to press now, you'll see that I leave the editing mode. And then by clicking back in, I've entered it. And then by pressing Shift Enter, I will now do Shift Enter, it will execute this and it will move to the next cell. So Shift Enter. Now I'm in the next cell. See how that got selected here, but I'm not in the edit mode yet. Now I am, now that I've left clicked my cursor inside of this cell here. And now if I do Shift Enter again, you will watch that this cell now gets selected. It'll have a blue bar next to it. Again, there's the blue bar. See? That's what Shift Enter does. It executes and moves on to the next cell. Now this is a code cell. This is an example of a code comment. It has either the pound sign or the hash symbol, depends on what you call it. A lot of that's generational in terms of what you call that symbol right there. But that's a code comment. That's a line of code that's not executed. You can also put comments on the side of a piece of code or some sort of operation that you're doing in the code, like I've done here. So I often will put code comments for you to read inside the code, and I will often ask you to add comments to code as you learn to understand and interpret what's going on inside of code. It's a great way to learn by adding useful code comments. So if you run this now, I could do it with Control Enter, and you'll watch I won't move on. There's the output of 17 times 235. It's 3,995. I suppose you could try to verify that by hand. I'll trust the computer here. And you notice I've run some operations already. This input right here, this was the second cell I've run, and then it generated an output, 3,995. If I add a semicolon to the output to this operation, and I run it, no output is generated. It suppresses the output with a semicolon. I also talk about that in another code cell. But I'll just go ahead and now hit Shift Enter, and notice that it executed again, but now I've run it a few times, so that number is updated to 4. It was previously at 2, because I've run it a couple more times. And notice by Shift Enter again, I moved on to this next code. Now when I added that hash symbol, or pound sign, whatever you want to call it, to the left of the operation 17 times 235, when I run this code cell now, so it's executed, but there's no output. And it's not because I had a semicolon here. I had no semicolon. This is commented out, meaning it will not run. So this code cell produces quite literally nothing. It looks just like 3 separate code comments with blank lines separating them. So the Python kernel executes this and says, well, there was nothing for me to do. There was no code for me to really execute because it will just ignore the comments. This is a raw cell, and again, we'll go back here for a second. When I'm selected when I have my cursor in any of these, so you notice again the blue bounding box, so this isn't selected, or I just select it to the side, so it's a code cell. Notice right here it says it's a code cell. That part of the notebook will alert you to what type of cell you have, and you can change it. You might say, well, I want to change a code cell to a markdown cell. Now look how different it looks, and watch what happens. That's huge because that pound sign, if we go back to our cheat sheet, the first thing that you actually notice in the cheat sheet are headers. And a single pound sign in a markdown cell will create a large header, the first type of header. 2 pound signs in a row in a markdown cell will create a second header, a subheader, subheading. You'll notice I actually use these in here when I create certain size headers for describing certain sections of the notebook to describe what's going on. So for instance here, there's the 3 pound signs again, and that's how I make the text a little larger. Here there was 2 because that's a section of this notebook. And If I come up here, I believe this is also 2. I'm often using 2 because I think that's large enough for the text. And then I think I might use 1 up here for just the name of the course. Yeah. So there's that 1 header. So again, these are in markdown cells. So those make basically large size text, certain types of header text. And when it's in a, so I'm scrolling down here. Let me go back to where I was. I scrolled too far, excuse me. Here we go. I could make this, 3 pound signs, and it makes it a little smaller. And I could do that to this as well, right? But this is now a markdown cell. So this is not a code cell. So I could technically run it, but it's not doing anything other than rendering the text in the appropriate way. But if I change it back to a code cell, you'll notice it's here. And now if I try to run this again, it still doesn't execute anything, because as soon as you have 1 pound sign, 1 hashtag, 1 hash in front of a line or to the left of a line, everything else to the right of that hash, so all of this other stuff, is just considered text, and it's not read by Python when it's executed. So as soon as you have 1, you have a code comment. So I'll go ahead and just switch it back to the way it was. Same thing. I execute again, nothing happens. So it's back to a code environment, and this one is a raw code cell, as you can see here, raw, which is just something that looks like a code cell, but it doesn't execute. So if I did shift enter there, I do control enter, notice there's no in or output that's coming from this from running. There's nothing that's showing up here. So I'll end this video here. That gives you an idea, an overview of what goes into these notebooks in terms of mostly markdown and code cells. There is a raw option here, but we will not, I think this is maybe the only example of a raw code cell, or excuse me, a raw cell that I use in the entire class. They're not typically used. Typically, we'll just use markdown and code cells, and that's very common in practice as well. So that's it. Hopefully you got something out of this. You can read, I really encourage you to read through this carefully, especially the very beginning of this notebook that describes what this course is and how to set your expectations for how to do some time management and what we're focusing on in this class. You really should read that very, very carefully. And I will end this video here. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video that will describe how notebooks are used for lecture materials in this class in terms of how we use them for activities and how that factors into your grade. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.